With this final lecture of the section, we are going to have a look at what you can do to improve your lexical resource score in general, how to maximize it. So we'll be thinking about things like range, precision, and collocation. This is quite a long lecture after the previous three lectures really just looked at vocabulary and expressions that you can use across the different letter types. Here we'll be talking about vocabulary more generally and looking at different skills that we can employ to maximize our lexical resource score. So let's start by thinking about paraphrasing and about increasing your range of vocabulary, avoiding repetition. The expression range of vocabulary is used in the lexical resource category of the band descriptors for bands 5, 6, 7, and 8. It covers a lot of the different bands. The key difference in these bands is in the adjective that appears before the expression range of vocabulary. Let's have a look at that in detail. Band 5 uses a limited range of vocabulary. Band 6 uses an adequate range of vocabulary. Band 7 uses a sufficient range of vocabulary, and Band 8 uses a wide range of vocabulary. Now, ignoring the issue that adequate and sufficient are mostly synonymous adjectives and they can mean the same thing, you can see that in general what we're looking at is that basically the more range, the better. The greater your range of vocabulary, the higher your band score will be. And how can we produce range? Well, we can avoid repetition. How do we do this? Well, there are a number of techniques that we can use to meet this paraphrasing aim of avoiding repetition. And we're going to talk about those now. I go into more detail on these in the Task 2 course, but I'm talking about all the techniques in this lecture as well and putting them in context of letter writing. So we can use synonyms, we can use referencing, we can use word formation, we can use antonyms, and we can change word order as well. So let's look at this in the context of an actual task. Now here, we don't have the task itself, but we do have two sentences which have been used in the letter response. And we're looking at a very isolated instance of just a couple of words, and you can see these words in bold: 2 weeks. It has now been 2 weeks since I was last contacted by the bank. That means that for the last 2 weeks, I have been without a credit card, which has made it very difficult for me to manage my financial affairs. Let's look at each of these paraphrasing techniques one by one. Synonyms, first of all. Okay, so instead of saying that means for the last 2 weeks, we can simply change the language to something that means the same thing. That's all a synonym is. It's another word for the same thing. That means that for the last fortnight, a fortnight is 2 weeks, I have been without a credit card. How about referencing? Now, we looked at referencing in the previous section, so hopefully you can remember what that generally means. So in this case, instead of saying it has now been 2 weeks, later we can say that means for this whole time. You can see that referencing device, this. So referring to the time that we mentioned earlier, and that is 2 weeks. We add the word whole just to emphasize that it is the whole thing, not just a part of those 2 weeks, but the whole 2 weeks. So for this whole time, because we've thought to ourselves that a week is a division of time, so we can use the word time instead. Okay, we're going to move to a different task to think about the other three techniques. And this time we have got the task in front of us. You recently left some important documents on a train. Write a letter to the train company. Okay, so we want to paraphrase the language in the task to avoid repetition. It's something that the examiners will notice if you rely on the task language. One way we can avoid the word important is we can think about word formation. So what are other classes of the word important? Important is the adjective. We can think about using the noun instead. The documents in question are of great importance, so it is vital that they are located and returned post haste. Okay, so important to importance. We can also think about antonyms. So as synonyms are different words for the same thing, antonyms are like the opposites. We're trying to communicate an opposite meaning. So you recently left some important documents on a train. The loss of these documents is no trivial matter. Trivial is the opposite of important. It's an antonym. But notice that if we negate the antonym, then we come up with a way of paraphrasing, a different way of saying the same thing. If it is not trivial, it's important. So it is of no trivial matter. Sometimes this doesn't always work, so be careful. For instance, if you said it is not hot today, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's cold. But some expressions, particularly in the way that they are worded, can be useful ways of paraphrasing. If you say it's no trivial matter, we, as native speakers, we understand this to mean it's actually quite important. Okay? And lastly, we can think about word order. So you recently left some important documents on a train. You can see they've highlighted the word left there as well, just to emphasize that we're going to move these sentence elements around. You've got verb followed by adjective followed by noun. So now we're going to switch those around and we're going to go noun, the documents, followed by adjective, which are very important, followed by verb, and we can do this because it's in the passive voice, were left in carriage A, seat 12 upon my exit. You may argue that left is the same. You can see you recently left and were left. However, it is actually a different class of word in a sense because we've changed the voice. We've gone away from using the active, you recently left, to using the passive, were left by me in carriage A. Okay, so lots of different ways that we can avoid repetition. So if you're ever thinking, oh, I'm not sure, I feel like I have to repeat a word, how can I paraphrase? Just remember these 5 techniques: synonyms, referencing, word formation, negating antonyms, and word order. And if you still can't think of another word, then don't worry. Use the same word, underline that word, and come back to it later if you have time. Paraphrasing is not your number one priority. It can be helpful, but there are other more important things to think about, like accurate grammar and about finishing the task itself. So if you can't think of another word within about 30 seconds, please underline that word, come back to it later. Let's think about spelling and word formation. A lot of people struggle with spelling and word formation, but do bear in mind that you can make occasional errors in these regards and still score a band 7. However, of course, we should aim to produce no errors at all. This may give you a little leeway if you make other errors, if you produce none at all. So how can we improve in this important skill? Well, I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but I'm going to give you 4 pieces of advice. First of all, as you practice, identify any errors made and notice any patterns in the errors that you make, maybe particular sounds you identify incorrectly. You can do this by just putting your practice into a word processor and turning on the spell checker. Secondly, write down the correct form and again notice any patterns with the error and the correction. Maybe there's a particular error that you always make and the correction is always quite similar. Consider which words are most likely to appear in IELTS, particularly when you're thinking about letter writing. And if those come up in your practice, really focus on those. And practice writing sentences with these words daily. So the words with frequent errors that you make and those words which are most likely to appear in IELTS, particularly if those 2 factors are combined. Practice writing sentences with those words every day until they really are cemented in your mind in the correct form. Now let's move to precision. So, returning to the band descriptors. In order to score a band 7, a sufficient range of vocabulary is required to allow for some flexibility. We've talked about flexibility with regards to range and precision. Now, this is one of the most common failings of written work in IELTS. A lot of people think about the range of vocabulary they use, but they don't necessarily think about how precise the vocabulary is. So we're going to have a look at a couple of examples, and I want you to think about which would score highest in this regard, in the regard of precise vocabulary. So we've got 2 here, and one has 40 words and one has 35 words. That could be an important thing to think about. Sorry it took so long to write. I have just been very busy at work. I was working on 2 projects and both of them required a lot of effort. There has been so much to do since I started. Sorry I couldn't write sooner. I was recently put in charge of 2 work projects, both of which had totally unrealistic deadlines, and I have just been snowed under with paperwork ever since I started. Now, which one of these extracts would be better in terms of the precision of its vocabulary? Now, although the second one is shorter, it is actually more precise. It communicates more details. And so the reader has a better idea of what's going on. We say, sorry it took so long to write, and sorry I couldn't write sooner. We have more of an idea of the time element here. We say, I've just been very busy at work. I was working on 2 projects. We don't know what the level of responsibility is, but with the second one, I was recently put in charge of 2 work projects. We know that we're managing them, so there's a lot more stress and pressure involved. And we have both of them required a lot of effort. Okay, we had to work hard, but the second one, we find out that there were unrealistic deadlines. We find out there were deadlines at all. So we know a little bit more there. And finally, there has been so much to do since I started. Contrast that with, I have been snowed under with paperwork ever since I started. So the second one, we know more than just that we had a lot of work. We know that it's specifically paperwork, so writing things out. We don't know, for example, in the first one, we don't know whether it was paperwork or whether it was managing other employees or whether it was managing financial things. So for the second one, despite the fact that it's shorter, it's actually more precise. So don't think about the length of your response. Think about how much detail it contains in the words that you choose. Finally, we can think about collocation. Collocation, another important element for achieving a band 7, uses less common lexical items, basically vocabulary, with some awareness of style and collocation. So it's important to think about what collocation is. Collocation is about choosing the words that fit naturally with other words. For instance, in many languages, it's appropriate to say, I want to make a picture. But that's not the case in English. In English, we want to say, I want to take a picture. That is an example of a collocation. Now, to improve in terms of your collocation skill, read, and read some more. I always recommend that. You'll begin to see that some of the collocations that exist in your language don't exist in English, and they can be quite different. Try to notice patterns in both speech and writing, and refer to collocation dictionaries as well if you are unsure. Websites like freecollocation.com are very, very useful. If you want to know more about collocation specifically, again, you may want to think about checking out the specific lecture in the Task 2 course. That brings us to a close in this vocabulary section, in this lexical resource section. So we can now move on to the final band descriptor category, the one that we haven't looked at yet, which is grammatical range and accuracy.